Talking today about fear and how different things can restrict you and keep you from living the life, your best life. So I want to start by just showing you a picture I took when I was in Kuwait in 2018. Camel on the side of the road. You might not be able to see it in that picture, but if I change it into a close-up, you see that there's this rope around the camel's legs. That camel was standing there in the desert, wide open and free, but yet not moving. Staying right where it was. One of the locals says that the camel would just kind of walk around in circles, but it would stay there just because of that little rope. And I just said, you know what, is that my story? Is that your story? Held back from experiencing our best life possible because of something small like that little rope, or end up just living our lives walking around in circles. I know people who have spent, the last 10, 20 years dealing with the same exact issue. Like they're just stranded or stuck in that spot and they can't move. And really, that's the story of Moses and the Israelites in their journey through the desert to the promised land. They got this close to the promised land, this close, but because of fear, because they didn't want to face a battle or face a challenge, they turned around and for 40 years roamed in the desert, avoiding this challenge, avoiding this fear, which they eventually had to face anyway. It did not have to be this way. I want to share with you right now this story of Moses, the Israelites in the desert. And I hope it will either remind you of who you were or inspire you to be the person that you know you can be. To think about what might be holding you back. It might not be a whole lot. That, if you just push through a little bit more, breakthrough is closer than you think. And you can make that final push into the promised land, just like Moses and the Israelites almost did. I want to tell you that story right now. And you remember from previous lessons, the Israelites were slaves in Egypt, and Moses went before Pharaoh and said, "Let my people go." And eventually Pharaoh did, and Moses and the Israelite slaves were liberated. They were freed, but they had to walk through the desert to get through this promised land that God had told Moses about. This land that God said was flowing with milk and honey, that had everything they would ever need to be prosperous, and live life for generations in prosperity. They had to go through the desert to get there. But now, at this point in time where I begin the story, they were about 75 miles from the promised land. 75 miles from the place that they were waiting to go. And Moses, as the military commander, decides to send out a recon team. A team to go explore this promised land and come back and tell Moses and everybody what they saw. And so Moses gives out his guidance in the book of Numbers, chapter 13, beginning with verse 17. And it says this. It says, when Moses sent them to explore Canaan, that's the promised land, he said, "Go up through the Negev and onto the hill country. See what the land is like, and whether the people who live there are strong or weak, few or many. And what kind of land do they live in? Is it good or bad? What kind of towns do they live in? Are they walled or unwalled or fortified? How is the soil? Fertile or poor? Are there trees on it or not? Do your best to bring back some of the fruit of the land." It was the season for the first ripe grapes. And so this is Moses' guidance. Go and check out what is going on in this land so we all can have an idea of where we're going. And so he sends out a group of 12, and they go do that, and they go explore it, and here's their report. A little later on in Numbers chapter 13, verse 26, it says, "They came back to Moses and Aaron and the whole Israelite community at Kadesh in the desert of Paran," which again is about 75 miles south of this promised land. "And there they reported to them and the whole assembly and showed them the fruit of the land." Check this out in verse 27. They gave Moses this account. "We went into the land to which you sent us, and it does flow with milk and honey. Here is the fruit." And they showed Moses and the people these huge, wonderful, tasty beautiful grapes that were just indicative of this fertile and great land. But in verse 28, after showing them this great fruit and saying, yeah, the land was great, verse 28 starts with the word but. But the people who live there are powerful, and the cities are fortified and very large. And we even saw descendants of Anak there. And Anak were like giants. They were like very well built, tall, strong people. So the report is like a mixed review. Yes, this land is flowing with milk and honey. Yes, this land is fertile. Yes, we can make great lives for ourselves there. But there are strong, mighty, and large people there. What do you do? Mixed review. So it went two ways. There were two camps, if you will, at this time of decisions and directions of what the Israelites should do. What the Israelites did depended on what the camp focused on. In other words, what you see and what you focus on determine the direction you go in. So let me explain what I mean. There are two camps. What camp are you in as we go over these camps? First, there's this camp I'm just going to call the people of Israel. Okay, this was mostly everybody. They reacted in fear. They focused on the giants. Numbers chapter 14. That night, all the people of the community raised their voices and wept aloud. Listen to what they said. All the Israelites grumbled against Moses and Aaron, and the whole assembly said this to them: if we had only died in the desert, or in this desert, in Egypt, or in this desert. Why is the Lord bringing to us this land only to let us fall by the sword? Our lives and children will be taken as plunder. Wouldn't it be better for us to go back to Egypt? And they said to each other, we should choose a leader and go back to Egypt. So let's think about some of the things that the people of Israel said here in rebellion against this idea of going and taking this promised land and going and fighting this last battle. The people reacted in fear. Look at verse 2. They say, if we'd only died in Egypt, if we'd only died in the desert. Here's the first point when we think about fear. Fear clouds our future. For them, the battle was over before it even began. For them, they were defeated before the battle started. Have you ever said, why bother, or it doesn't matter? You're letting fear dictate or cloud your future. Determine what's going on. They lost before they fought the battle. If we'd only died in Egypt. Then we say in verse 3, they say, why is the Lord bringing us into this land only to let us fall by the sword? Why is God bringing us here only to kill us? They're questioning, not only are they questioning God, they're questioning everything that God had done previously up to this point to get them where they were. Fear not only clouds our future, fear clouds our memory. God had done so much for them just in the past couple of months that they completely forgot about. And a lot of times when we're letting fear dictate the terms in our lives, we forget about our past victories. We forget about the gifts or the opportunities or the talents that we have. And we just say we have no chance. The relationship has no chance. I have no chance. Fear not just clouds our future, but it clouds our memory. Then we look at verse 4, where they say, hey, we should choose another leader and go back to Egypt. I cannot believe they said this in verse 4. We should choose another leader and go back to Egypt. Fear also clouds our judgment. Hello, they were slaves in Egypt. They had suffered greatly for centuries in Egypt under the thumb of Pharaoh. And now they're saying, on the verge of going to the promised land, we should go back to Egypt. See, fear does these things to us. It clouds our future. It clouds our memory. It clouds our judgment. And we end up making decisions that aren't the best thing for us. So that was the first camp. The people that were making the decision focused on the fear, focused on the threat. But then you had two men. You had Joshua and Caleb, who were focusing on something different. They weren't focused on fear. They were focused on faith. I want to read to you what their response was. The people spoke first and said, this is what we should do. We should turn around from this challenge and we should run away. But Joshua and Caleb said this. They said in verse 7, the land we passed through and explored is exceedingly good. If the Lord is pleased with us, he will lead us into that land, a land flowing with milk and honey, and he will give it to us. Only do not rebel against the Lord, and do not be afraid of the people of the land, because we will swallow them up. Their protection is gone, but the Lord is with us. Do not be afraid of them. So they saw the same exact thing that the people saw. They were in that land. They just focused on something completely different. And their response was, we need to push. We need to move forward. We need to get this promised land. They responded with faith. Faith. Look at verse 7. It says that the land we passed through is exceedingly good. Faith sees the prize. Fear saw the challenge. Fear saw the threat. Fear clouded the future based upon that. Faith sees the prize, the promotion, the better life, the healthier marriage, the healthier relationship. The focus is that good thing. They saw this land that was just going to overproduce food for everybody. Hey, that's ours. Verse 8 says that God will lead us into that land. This land, they said in verse 8, flowing with milk and honey. It's an interesting term, this land flowing with milk and honey. That was how God initially described this land to Moses way back when. And so what Aaron and Joshua were doing, they were focusing on the vision. Hey, remember, we have been after this land flowing with milk and honey. Use the same exact words to maybe trigger that same memory in their head. This was what they initially fought for. Faith remembers the vision. Faith remembers that initial prompt. What started all of this? It wasn't just faith that focused on the prize. It brought them back to why we first started this, why we first went into business, why we first joined the army, why we first got together in the first place. Then verse 9. Joshua and Caleb says, hey, those people, the people of Anak, their protection is gone, and the Lord is with us. Faith trusts in God. A God whose plans for us are good. A God who promises never to leave, abandon, or forsake us. A God who loves us. So there were two camps. There was the camp that was going to react in a fear that clouded the future, that clouded the memory, that clouded their judgment. It wanted them to go back and become slaves again. And then there was a decision based upon faith that sees the prize, focuses on the prize, that remembers the vision that started it all, and that trusted in God. And if you keep reading, you read that the people won that night. The mob ruled, and they turned around. And they avoided the challenge. The Bible tells us that for 40 years, the Israelites wandered in the desert, running away, letting fear and control their memory, their future, their judgment. But the bottom line is this, is that they still had to face the same challenge. Because 40 years later, they made it into the promised land, but they had to face those giants. They had to face those people. They had to fight that battle. They ran around in circles for nothing. They wasted their life for 40 years for nothing. And they let fear distort their future, their memory, their judgment. I encourage you today to push through. Because what might be before you might look scary, but it might not be as scary as it is. It might be as small as that rope that's wrapped around the camel's legs, that's making that camel walk in circles. Live like Joshua and Caleb. Dare to chase and confront and live in faith, a faith that sees the prize, a faith that remembers the vision, a faith that trusts God, a faith that enables you to walk in peace today and have the best day possible.